Well, let me ask you about this. So Milliken gets elected with George Romney in 1964. Was Milliken brought into the inner sanctums of the executive office to work with people like you and Dan Hoff and Lucille Kaplinger and whoever else was there? Or was he kind of isolated as a lieutenant governor, like many vice presidents are kind of forgotten and overlooked by presidents in the past? What was it like? What happened?
It depended on who called the meeting.
Meaning?
Was Bill invited or not?
Yeah, but I mean, who would call a meeting other than the governor?
Well, some of the staff.
You mean staff people
Yeah.
would call a meeting, and certain, like if you called a meeting, you'd include Milliken.
Right, but if Bob Danoff called it, I don't think Milliken would have been there. I shouldn't say that, but that's the case.
Well, I mean, in other words, Milliken never really got on the inside with Romney personally. And what do you think Romney's attitude was toward Bill Milliken as a fellow Republican politician? What do you think?
I don't know. I've never really thought about that. It seems to me that at the time Romney had so much to do, and it wasn't a matter of delegating anything to Bill Milliken. I think we just let him pretty much go off by himself.
Well, let me flash forward 6
right.
years, 6 years to 1970, when you said you helped Bill Milliken with the Procreate thing. One other thing that happened that year, and you may not have been privy to this, but maybe you've talked to people about it. George Romney is down in Washington as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development for Richard Nixon. Bill Milliken is now his replacement successor as governor, having succeeded to the governorship when Romney resigned a year and a half before to take the cabinet job with Nixon. But all of a sudden, George Romney is sending signals that he wants Lenore Romney, who had never run for public office in her life herself, to run for the U.S. Senate against incumbent Democratic Senator Phil Hart. And there were a lot of people in the Republican Party who were resistant to that. I mean, some of them maybe didn't like the Romneys. There was a state senator named Bob Huber, very conservative. Yeah. He'd already announced, I'm running against Phil Hart, and I'm not getting out of the race. I don't care whether Lenore Romney runs or not. And he didn't get out. And Lenore Romney allowed herself to be kind of recruited to run, but she had to face Bob Huber in a primary. Well, she barely beat Bob Huber in a primary, for heaven's sakes. And then she proved to be a pretty disastrous candidate in November against Phil Hart. Do you have any knowledge about what happened? Why would Romney be pushing to have Lenore Romney run for the U.S. Senate while he's down in Washington as HUD Secretary?
That was the question I raised. Why? It made no sense, and I was opposed to it. So were other people, because first of all, they didn't think she'd get the resources, the money to do it. I don't know where Max Fisher was on this thing, but it was a recruitment effort by people who thought that the Romney name and legacy would carry her through. But there was no evidence at all, polling or otherwise, to indicate that this would happen. So there was sort of a feeling of, well, why should we do this? I mean, why waste a nomination? First of all, Phil Hart was almost impossible to beat. It just seemed foolish at the time.
Well, let me ask this also.
But I don't know what George's role was in that. I doubt.
Supposedly, he was the one who was really pushing it. I mean, the Milliken people were saying, why are you doing this? And they wanted to be respectful to George Romney, and they didn't want to offend him, but you could tell they were not happy about this. I was there when Lenore Romney made her speech to the assembled Republicans in the Jack Tar Hotel across from the Capitol, and it was uninspiring. But she stayed in the race anyway.
I find that hard to believe that he really pushed her. They had a special relationship.
Yeah.
You may know that he tried to give her a flower every day.
Every day.
But what they didn't know was sometimes he forgot. So we'd be in a hotel, and he would sneak around and pull a flower out of the display, or out of a. I mean, I shouldn't tell this story, but then put it along with a note for Lenore.
Didn't he usually put it on her pillow every morning?
Yeah.
Wasn't that the story? But you mean these were on display? They were plastic flowers?
No, these were real flowers.
They were real flowers.
Oh, yeah.
Well, at least they were real.
But he had a really high regard for her, and she was the last person who ever talked to him every night.
Yeah.
So, talk about...
absolutely. Well, let me ask you this. A year and a half before all this transpired, with Lenore possibly running for the Senate, Romney he didn't just peremptorily do it like it was a shock. People had heard rumors for weeks, but he resigned as governor halfway through his third term, which was the first 4-year elected term for a governor in Michigan history because of your Constitution. And he quit. Why? Did he feel his job had been done in Michigan, that he'd gotten the income tax through, that there was fiscal integrity restored? Had he grown bored with the job? Did he get Potomac fever from his aborted presidential campaign, where he thought, it might not be so bad being down in Washington? Was it something about housing? Because remember, he had pushed open housing as an issue, as part of maybe the same kind of thinking that caused him to champion
really, he had gone
civil
on
rights
that tour
Yeah.
of all the cities, the major cities, and the housing and the poverty and all that. And I think there was another feeling, which was that the Citizens for Michigan idea could be put on the national level, and Citizens for America or something like that.
Right.
And I think that was part of it. I think he felt by that time most of the con delegates who were on his staff, he had gone through a major staff changes, probably just felt, it's time to do something else. But I suspect it was because of dealing with urban problems, housing problems, and that maybe he could do something at the national level that he couldn't do at the state level.
So you think it was really a sincere impulse to say, maybe I can make a difference here at housing and urban development?
Sure. He had been in Washington when he was younger.
Yes, absolutely. He worked for a Massachusetts
and I don't think he had any
aspirations at
aspirations
that point.
in Nixon's cabinet.
No.
They were still, I think, like this. I think one of your questions you asked me about Romney being Nixon's vice presidential candidate.
Right. What about that?
Well, what happened was...
At the convention in 1968, when Nixon picked Spiro Agnew.
I was picked up as a fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard. And this is the summer of '68, and I get a call, Governor Romney wants you to be at the convention in Miami. And I couldn't figure out, because I'd been out of there now for 6 months, what he wanted me to do in Miami. Well, what he had in mind was to talk to the people I knew in the National Press Corps to find out what they thought of the idea of a Nixon-Romney ticket.
Ooh.
Well, the first guy I had breakfast with, Dave Broder, when I asked him the question, ordered a Bloody Mary. I mean, he said, that's the nuttiest thing I've ever heard of. But there was an effort within the staff, I think, to see if they couldn't get Romney on the vice presidential ticket, but that was never going to happen, of course, with Nixon.
Right.
But there was still, in the summer of '68, they were still hoping and thinking that Romney might be able to do that.
And Romney himself thought that was a possibility.
Oh, sure.
Obviously.
Sure.
Well, okay, let's go back to just Goldwater a minute. I just want to ask you a really big, sweeping question, and that is, obviously Goldwater is kind of the archetype of the Cro-Magnon, knuckle-dragging conservative Republican from the 60s. And George Romney was this dynamo progressive governor in the same stripe as Nelson Rockefeller and Mark Hatfield and John Chafee of Rhode Island and people like that. Today, times have changed. Social and cultural issues, for instance, have become so much more important than they were then. Things like gay rights and flag burning and all sorts of social cultural issues, about which George Romney, and you could already start to see this in the late 60s and early 70s, became, very uncomfortable with because of his Mormon background, I think, and his moral code. Whereas Barry Goldwater, amazingly enough, was a kind of old-style Western libertarian on social cultural issues. He didn't really care that much about these issues. In fact, the Arizona Republican Party got so disgusted with Goldwater in later years, they tried to take his name off the headquarters. They said, Goldwater's deserted us and drifted off into left field. I mean, how do we look at George Romney and Barry Goldwater today and the kind of politicians they were and the Republican Party as it existed then and the Republican Party today? What do you think?
Well, you see, I would argue that George Romney really was a conservative because the way he approached public policy was, if you have a problem and you identify it, can you solve it privately? Or if you can't do that, can you solve it with a combination of private and governmental resources? And then finally, if you can't do it with either one of those two, can you solve it by government? He was not afraid to use government, which I think many Republicans are afraid. So I would have argued that, plus the way he felt about civil rights, that today he would fit in with some of what the Republicans. He would not fit in with Donald Trump. I mean, he would never, he would never have endorsed Donald Trump. But I think he could have fit in on that basis. But I don't think any people would pay any attention to him. They would just write him off as far too liberal, whatever that meant.